Today we're going to talk about clean and unclean. This is an issue that produces much controversy. Many believe that clean and unclean does not apply to our time anymore because, according to some philosophies, Jesus declared all things clean, so we are no longer under these prohibitions. Some believe that this is only a purely Jewish concept. So we have to go to the Bible to find out where this issue comes from. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, "And of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by sevens the male and his female, and of the beasts that are not clean by two, the male and his female, of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of the earth." So the issue of clean and unclean is not a Jewish issue at all. In fact, this already existed before the flood. And before the flood, there were already clean animals and unclean animals. Now, if God created everything perfect, and He says it was good, it was very good, then why do we have clean and unclean animals? Did something perhaps change? Did circumstances change on the planet? Now, I'm going to look at this from a scientific perspective. I know that there are ideological reasons for considering these things thus, but let's have a look at it from the aspect of science. It's interesting that Noah builded an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Genesis 8:20. Now, what were the criteria that determined whether a creature was clean or whether it was unclean? And if some say it was only a Jewish issue, then why do we have it here in the times of Noah already, with a very clear distinction between what was clean and what was unclean? Obviously he knew, and only later was it recorded by the authors of the book of Leviticus. Now, we don't find clean and unclean laws only in Jewish culture. Islamic law forbids the eating of pork, and the methods of slaughter that are used in Islam are very similar to those that are used by the Jews. In many societies, the eating of pork was prohibited. The Navajos and the Yakuts of northern Turkey, as well as the Laplanders, had prohibitions on the eating of pork. Now, that's just one animal. What about all the other issues? Well, it's fascinating that the Iranians were not allowed to eat fish that did not have both fins and scales. Now, where did that come from? This surely is something that goes back even further. Also, the inhabitants of the South Pacific will not eat eel, which is also an animal that falls into the category of the unclean. So there are very interesting events here. Similar laws to the Levitical code existed amongst the ancient Hindus, and the code of Manu, Manu was the Hindu equivalent of Noah, forbade the eating of all carnivorous birds and all animals that did not have a cloven hoof. So here we have the same criteria in a totally different religious setup, and it goes back to the time of Noah. So it's not a Jewish law. Does it still apply today, or does it not? That is another issue that we will have to look at. "And the Lord spoke unto Moses and to Aaron, saying unto them, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, These are the beasts which you shall eat among all the beasts that are on the earth." So here is the complete description in the book of Leviticus as to what is unclean and what is clean, and what the difference is. "Whatsoever parteth the hoof and is cloven-footed and cheweth the cud amongst the beasts that ye shall eat, nevertheless these shall you not eat of them that chew the cud." Now, scientifically speaking, chewing the cud is the regurgitation out of a pre-chamber in the stomach and re-chewing of the food before it is further digested. Now, it's fascinating that the animals that are listed over here that have the same sort of physiology and anatomy, like the camel, for example, is unclean, for example. "Nevertheless, these ye shall not eat of them that chew the cud, and of them that divide the hoof, the camel. Because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you." So certain animals have a similar anatomy, like those that have the cloven hoofs, and yet they are still considered unclean. Some others that are mentioned, and the coney, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean unto you. And the hare, that's all the rabbit family, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you. Now the scientific fraternity, which regards chewing of the cud something that is depicted in ungulates, will say, well, the rabbit doesn't chew the cud. Yes, he does. He just chews it at a later stage, as we will see in a moment. So the biblical concept is a little bit broader. The animals are chewing that which they have ingested before. So the coney, the rabbit, they are unclean. And the swine, though he divide the hoof and be cloven-footed, yet he cheweth not the cud. He is unclean to you. Of their flesh shall you not eat, and their carcass shall you not touch. They are unclean to you. So here is a very distinct description. So let's have a look at some of these creatures. Leviticus 11, 1 to 8. Well, there's a modern cow, and this creature, of course, chews the cud. Now, cows and ungulates in general have a pre-stomach, which is called the rumen, and there a fermentation process takes place. Sheep and goats fall into that same category. So if we go through the animals of the world that are considered clean, that fall into the clean category, we will have all the various wild and domestic goats in the world. We will have the ungulates of the fields, like the oryx, will be a clean animal, and all the buck and deer and game that we find out there in the world will be considered clean. And of course, they went into the ark in pairs of 7s. All of these beautiful creatures, the kudus, these are all clean animals. Fascinating and beautiful. There's the bongo with its stripes. Now, this is their anatomy. They have this pre-stomach, which is called the rumen. And if you look at the anatomy, you find the rumen, which is a large fermentation chamber. So the food that they chew, largely vegetation, enters into the rumen. Their bacteria ferment this product. And in ruminants with a cloven hoof, this food is regurgitated, goes back into the mouth, is chewed over and over and over, and goes back into the rumen. And then it passes through various chambers like the omasum, the abomasum, and eventually comes to the true stomach, the abomasum, where it is digested. And this fermented food passes all the way through the intestine, and the rest is then defecated. Now, what is fascinating is that this process is a continuum, and the bacteria add certain nutrients which are not available in the plant material. For example, they will add certain varieties of amino acids which they produce, and the bacteria themselves are digested in the process as they pass through the intestine, so they add the nutrients which might be scarce in the environment. So the animal gets a complete nutrition as a result of this rumination process. Bacteria, of course, produce many, many substances which we find are often absent in nature. So let's have a look at this creature over here. Nevertheless, these shall you not eat of them that chew the cud, or of them that have the divided hoof, that is the camel. Because he cheweth the cud, he has the same type of anatomy, he doesn't have the same foot anatomy, and the Bible says he is unclean. Now this is very strange. He has the same mechanism of eating, the same anatomy as far as that is concerned. Why is it considered unclean? Well, it's interesting that these creatures, a beautiful picture of a camel, have been adapted to a desert environment. So something has changed in the environment which might affect the physiology of this creature. It is beautifully adapted to the desert environment, but one of the things that it can do is it can tolerate heat by just not sweating. And that means that the body temperature starts increasing, but they don't lose water like other animals, so it can survive in the desert. But this also means that any toxins that are produced like urea, etc., will accumulate in the tissues. And the consequence is that the animal is not as fit for consumption as one that gets rid of all the toxic substances over time. So maybe that is one of the reasons why this creature is considered unclean. The coney, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof, he is unclean to you, and the hare, because he cheweth the cud, but divideth not the hoof. Now, why are these creatures unclean? They're also plant eaters, so in other words, they are very close to what the original diet on the planet was, and yet, when they have paws, these creatures, they tend to do something very interesting. They tend to practice coprophagy. Coprophagy, phagy means feeding. They ingest their own excreta. That's one of the reasons why these creatures might be considered unclean. So it's also a form of chewing the cud, but of course, instead of taking it from a pre-stomach, the rumen, and regurgitating it to the mouth, they're taking it from the other side. And that makes a big difference. When the food passes through the intestine, then waste products are left, together with digestible products at the end, and when recirculated, some of these chemicals like secondary bile salts and all of these issues which are detrimental are added to the food chain. So a rabbit, for example, rather than having a pre-stomach like a cow, has the fermentation taking place in the cecum, which is at the end of the intestine. So now there's only one possibility. You can't put the entire intestine into reverse, so the product has to pass out of the intestine, and the rabbit produces two kinds of feces. One is the pellet form, and the other one is a soft form, which it eats directly from the anus, and thereby the bacteria and the fermentation products which make the meal complete are re-ingested. But because it passes right through the intestine, you have some of the secondary products which are harmful also passing through the intestine, and this animal therefore has a higher toxic load than would a ruminant under normal circumstances. So we see the cecum here in this dissected creature is very, very large and lies there as a big fermentation chamber. If you unravel the intestine of a rabbit, for example, you have this normal intestine where the absorption takes place over here, and then you have the large cecum where the fermentation takes place. So the only possibility to re-ingest that is to take it from the other side. These animals are considered unclean. Now the horse also doesn't have a cloven hoof. It's considered unclean, and it qualifies for the same criteria as the rabbit and the hare, because it also has the cecum at the end of the intestine. And horses tend to coprophage in the natural environment as well. It's strange, if you give them all the food that they need and give them high quality feed with all the variants, there is less coprophagy than otherwise. So here we can see the anatomy of the intestine of the horse, and we have exactly the same criterion. We have the cecum at the end of the intestine as you have it in the case of the rabbit. So this creature is unclean. Now the pig is considered unclean in many, many societies. And there's probably a good reason why this creature is unclean. If we go through the list of the creatures that are listed as clean in the Bible, we will see that they are all herbivores. All of them are herbivores. They, in other words, feed at the lowest level of the trophic aspects of the ecosystem. What's also fascinating is although some of them are herbivores, some of them are unclean. And that is when the anatomy is as we described in the case of the hare and otherwise, where they have to change their habits in order to gain enough nutrition out of what they eat. Now the pig is omnivore. It eats anything. It will scavenge, it will eat plant material, it will eat animal material. And we know that there is a process called biological magnification. The further you go away from the lowest feeding levels, the plant base, the more toxin is added to the tissues. So on the basis of that alone, this creature would qualify as unclean. A pig, of course, is also known for many other diseases, parasitic and otherwise. Much of the parasite problem can be solved with the right medication, but there are other problems associated with pigs. Here is a snippet from one of the scientific magazines. Off the menu from early warnings that chickens were laying fewer eggs, the dioxin scandal grew to engulf Belgium's meat industry with a full ban on all poultry, beef and pork products. Here you have this question of biological accumulation of toxins, and the pig, of course, is one that qualifies in this regard. Then you have some strange diseases, viral diseases, which tend to be very prevalent in pigs. Now it's interesting that in the past, the pig was one of the nurturing chambers for viral change, so that a species barrier could be crossed from animals to man. And the pig was always considered as one of these viral chambers where these changes could take place. Burying the bacon, encephalitis diseases passing from the pig directly to the human. There are many, many reasons why pig should be considered unclean, scientifically speaking. Did human error spread a virus from pigs? Japanese encephalitis, a deadly disease, is spreading amongst farmers. So viruses jumping the species barrier often take a transitional phase in the pig. Pig transplants should be banned from hospitals. They use heart valves, etc. in the pigs. So again, the viral issue is of great importance. So God says, leave these creatures alone and you will have fewer problems. Skin and joint disorders, boils, hives, psoriasis, gout, many of these issues are often associated with the eating of many or high quantities of these creatures. And whatsoever goes upon his paws amongst all manner of beasts that go on all fours, those are unclean unto you. Whoever touches their carcasses shall be unclean until the evening, and that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening. They are unclean unto you. Leviticus 24:28. So creatures that walked on all fours were unclean. Now some people say, well, what about my dog and my cat? They go on all fours. Yes, but you're not going to eat them, are you? You're just going to love them and cuddle them. The Bible doesn't forbid you loving and cuddling your horse or riding on an unclean animal. Even the Lord Jesus rode on an unclean animal. It says you mustn't eat them. So why are these creatures with paws unclean? Well, as we saw previously, they also are coprophages. In other words, they tend to eat their own excreta, and so a dog will do exactly that, as many people with dogs will know. These also are unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth, the weasel, the mouse, the tortoise after its kind, the ferret, the chameleon, the lizard, the snail, the mole. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whosoever does touch them when they be dead shall be unclean until evening. Now that was a ritual law, but nevertheless, all of these creatures fall into those same categories. They are mostly not herbivores, and if they are herbivores, then they are coprophages. So again, they would suffer from higher levels of toxins than others. So all of these little creatures, cute and cuddly as they might be, are not fit, according to the Bible, for human consumption. And if we look at the little chipmunks and squirrels of the world, well, these creatures are unclean. They also tend to practice coprophagy. What is interesting, as the ecology deteriorates, for example, many forests are suffering a decline, so these creatures are finding it hard to find the sustenance that they need for life. And many of them are actually turning to roadkills and becoming scavengers, even eating animal products. So again, they fall into this category of biological magnification as we move from the lower levels of the plant world into the higher trophic levels of eating animal material. The elephant is very similar in its anatomy to the coney, so it falls into that category as well. Also, the coney has a relatively poor thermoregulation, which also affects the digestive system. So this creature would also be considered unclean, as well as the hippopotami and all of these fascinating creatures.